Hello, welcome to the SWS webinar for today, the Women Leaders in Wetland Science. My name is Carrie Reinhardt Adams. I'm a member of the Society of Wetland Scientists, and I'm also the chair of the Women in Wetland Section. I'm going to be your moderator today. My advisors in graduate school, who many of you probably know, Andy Cole, Rob Brooks, and Sue Galadowicz, they're all also SWS members, and they encouraged me to be part of the society, and I feel really fortunate to follow in their footsteps and be part of all the professional development opportunities that Society of Wetland Scientists offers. I'm an associate professor of wetland plant ecology and restoration here at the University of Florida, where it is actually 77 degrees Fahrenheit today. So to introduce our webinar, at the 2019 Society of Wetland Scientists meeting in Baltimore, the Women in Wetlands section organized a symposium, and the purpose of the symposium was to highlight the contributions of remarkable female scientists and policy experts in wetland science, management, restoration, and protection. And this webinar today features 4 of our speakers who are going to be sharing their experience with us. They're pioneers in their field and in protecting wetlands, and they're leaders in their organizations and institutions. And so today we have the privilege of hearing from Drs. Kathy Ewel, Carol Johnston, Line Rochefort, and Joy Zedler. So before we get started, I just need to make a few announcements. Webinar sponsorship opportunities is the first one. The SWS Webinar Committee has been hard at work lining up quality webinars for our members, such as this one. And in addition to expanding the international reach through the quarterly Spanish webinars and the soon-to-come wetland interviews, to support expanding programs, they opened for the very first time the opportunity to sponsor the regular SWS webinar series. We are limiting it to just 4 annual sponsors for maximum impact for those sponsors. If you're interested in learning more, please contact the committee members in charge of the sponsorship program. You can see Roy Massaros at the bottom of this slide here, or you can just email the SWS office if you're interested in hearing more. And we feature your sponsorship at the beginning and the end of the webinar, and while we're promoting the webinar as well. So we kicked off just this week with the sponsorship program, and we already have 2 of the 4 lucky sponsors. So I would like to thank Water Resources, Hydrology, and Hydraulics Education, one of our sponsors here. We'd like to acknowledge them for sponsoring the webinar. They are a nonprofit group that shares information on these topics to help educate and build a better tomorrow. And then our second sponsor, the Whittington Group. The Whittington Group is a natural resource consulting firm that balances regulatory compliance with sound ecological management. So you can find their information at their websites listed here. And we'd just like to thank them for sponsoring today's webinar. And for those of you that are not familiar with the webinars, I just want to give you a little insight here. The general format for today's webinar will be the presentations by our 4 panelists, followed by about 15 minutes of questions. And you can either ask a general question for all of our speakers, or you can direct them specifically to a speaker. And you can just use the questions panel on your GoToWebinar panel. So at any time during the presentation, you can type in your question and I will address it at the end of the presentation. And by the way, if you miss anything, the webinar is being recorded and we will send you a link to the recording at the conclusion of the webinar. Also, please take a moment to complete the evaluation survey to help us plan more of these events. And if you want a copy of today's slides, usually you see it there in the handout pane, but for this webinar particularly, there will be a handout emailed to attendees upon conclusion of the webinar. So another quick note, The webinar is applicable for CEUs that can be applied to your professional wetland scientist certification or renewal or other certifications. And documentation of your participation is going to be available through an automated process. So this will be initiated by an email from Michelle, our SWS Managing Director, and you should get that within 24 hours following the webinar. Careful, check your spam folder if you don't see it, because they can end up there, unfortunately. Participation certificates, these are also available for those who watch webinar recordings, and you can find that on past webinars, as you can see here on this page where the link to that is. So without further ado, we will now begin our presentation. I would like to reintroduce our panelists. We have 4 today, Drs. Kathy Ewel, Carol Johnston, Line Rochefort, and Joy Zedler. And so right now, I would like to turn it over to Kathy Ewel to allow her to begin her presentation. Also, before we begin, I would just like to thank the Women in Wetland section for all the work that they did organizing the symposium in 2019. And I especially want to thank our panelists for being willing to be a part of it again. There was definitely a lot of interest in hearing more and from those who had to miss presentations in Baltimore. So thanks again for doing that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kathy.
I can't get it back to my screen.
Looks good, Kathy. We can see it.
Okay, but I can't. Let me find it down here. Okay. In 1994, I left a perfectly good position at the University of Florida to move to Honolulu, Hawaii to work for the U.S. Forest Service. Whoops. The job that I moved to was to conduct research and outreach on forested wetlands in the general area called Micronesia, which is part of the former trust territory held by the US after the Second World War. The country I'm going to talk about today is the Federated States of Micronesia. And specifically, I'll talk about the island state of Carrie. When the Federated States of Micronesia achieved independence in 1986, it entered into a compact of free association with the US. In exchange for exclusive military access to the FSM waterways, the US committed to a stream of funding to encourage development of an independent economy in Micronesia. And this included things like increasing access to education at all levels, building infrastructure such as schools, hospitals, and roads. Carrie is a high island. It's the remains of an ancient volcano. It's about 40 square kilometers, which isn't very big. It's surrounded by a coral reef, and in the protected shoreline, we find mangroves around about 2/3 of the shoreline. The island receives about 4 meters of rainfall per year, and small rivers come down out of the mountains and lead across the coastal plain. And at various places, you'll find freshwater forested wetlands along these rivers. This is the populated side of the island, and you can see that people do live in pretty close association with their wetlands.
Kathy, just a minute. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it looks like your slides haven't advanced beyond the title slide.
Oh dear. Okay.
And I know you've got beautiful pictures there.
Let's see.
You try and advance them, and
let's see. I'll go back. Let's see. I'm retreating. I'm advancing them on my screen.
Let's
see. I don't know what to press here. Show screen.
I see it.
Okay.
Now we can see the island.
Okay. So now let me. Now let me try this. Okay. Now so you can see the island now?
Yep.
Okay. And this is the coral reef surrounding the island, and mangroves surround about 2/3 of the shoreline. Along the coastal plain, along the rivers that come down from the mountains, are smaller freshwater forested wetlands. How is this? You see the economy slide?
Looks great.
Okay, great. The economy of the Federated States of Micronesia, when I was working there, and it's pretty much the same state now, is not very strong. The biggest input is the leasing of fishing rights to their very productive tuna fishery, mostly to Chinese fishing boats. They're also trying to develop ecotourism, focusing mostly on diving, but also including access to canoe rides through the mangroves and hikes to the forested wetlands. Otherwise, farms and small factories sell products that can be sold to tourists or sent to surrounding islands. My colleagues, Roz Naylor and Mark Drew, documented a very strong subsistence economy. Most coastalians fish inside the reef, and there they find many fish that spend part or all of their life cycle in the mangroves. If they had to purchase at market those fish that they take from inside the reef, the firewood they harvest freely from the mangroves, or the mangrove crabs that they sell to the tourist hotels, they would have to spend roughly $1 billion per year. By the same token, they use the freshwater forested wetlands quite a bit as well. These are dominated by Terminalia carolinensis, which is an endemic species found only in Ponape and the neighboring island of Ponape and Koshrai, but most of Ponape's swamps have been cut over into taro fields. In Koshrai, they thin the swamps and they plant taro, bananas, and sugarcane. Eels swim in from the freshwater rivers. Feral pigs come attracted to the agriculture, and the wood is very, very useful. And so if they had to purchase all these at the market, they'd have to spend $3 million per year. So their wetlands are really worth $4 million per year. This is an island of 7,000 to 7,500 people, and this represents more than half of the average household income. So it's obviously a very important part of their life. Now these swamp forests are found all around the island, just upland from the mangroves. Most of them have been converted to agroforestry. I showed you a slide earlier of the eastern side of the island, which is one of the more populated areas. Today, I'd like to talk about a swamp on the west side of the island where nobody lives. This general area is called the Yule Valley, and it's very remote. It can be accessed only by sea. The swamp itself is privately owned, and by 3 families. And this is also the largest remaining stand of Terminalia carolinensis in the world. Now the freshwater swamp lies just upstream from the mangroves, and it's separated from the mangroves by a natural levee. And you can see along the top of the screen that the river that drains the swamp goes along the base of the mountains and then out through the mangroves. The first time I set foot in this swamp was my first field day in Koshrai, and I was just stunned by the magnificence of this forest. I was also stunned by the fact that there were stakes placed across the swamp marking the possible route for a road. Now, Judy Drexler did a very nice study documenting the fact that freshwater percolates through the levee, seeps through the levee into the mangroves, and moderating the salinity and making this a very, very productive mangrove stand, one of the most productive on the island. During a drought, such as during an El Nino year, salt water will percolate from the mangroves up into the freshwater swamp. So obviously, the this levee is extremely important. As it turns out, the best alternative for a road would be right along that levee at the inward side of the mangroves. And obviously anything that hardens that levee or culverts put in to raise the road up and let the water flow would pretty much destroy the integrity of that landscape. So the reason for building the road is to connect the two ends of the existing road. Then they would do that using funds available from the Compactor Free Association. The government sees this as a tourist attraction, a way of advertising to people that they could drive around the island and see this magnificent forest. And it's important to recognize that there is tremendous pressure to develop the economy. And this idea has had traction through several governors. It would also increase the access of the three families to the forest. They may not be interested in living there, but they might be interested in starting to develop its agroforestry potential. So over the next 11 years, I conducted research and outreach with a number of colleagues using the Yale stands for both, mostly for control plots. I talked to Koshrine colleagues, I talked to government officials, I talked to the legislature. We had community meetings talking about the importance of this intact landscape. I also talked to the Nature Conservancy and other conservation organizations. Towards the end of my tenure with the Forest Service, I brought in an independent team from the National Tropical Botanical Garden to get their opinion on the value of this forest. They found it was an extraordinary ecosystem, almost pristine, healthy, thriving, very few invasive alien weeds. The last thing I did when I retired from the Forest Service was to meet with government employees and the landowners to outline what I thought was important about saving that landscape, the entire landscape. And then I went back to Florida, and within a couple of years, the three families signaled that they were ready to consider some kind of conservation designation. So years passed, but finally in 2014, the Nature Conservancy issued a conservation easement, the first conservation easement in the Asia Pacific region for half of that watershed. And I have to say it was hydrologically the most important half of the watershed. The families would receive an income, a regular income, that would be handled by a Micronesian trust. Development and logging would be heavily restricted, although they could make some minor changes that would help people to get in to see the forest. And just as important, I think, is that other families, and even more importantly, other Pacific islands are considering now the same arrangement. So this was really one of the major highlights of my career. I saw an opportunity to make a difference to a society. I helped that society to understand and internalize the importance of conservation of that particular wetland. And I saw my vision come to fruition in a newly established process with considerable regional potential. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'll turn it over now to Carol Johnston.
Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate being invited to participate in this webinar. And Carrie, the air temperature here in northern Minnesota, where I'm presenting from, is -5 degrees Fahrenheit, little temperature difference from where. For those of you who don't know me, let's see, show my screen.
We see your slides.
You see my slides? Okay, there we go. Okay.
Looking good.
All right. I was the first female president of the Society of Wetland Scientists 28 years ago. I presided over the SWS's first international conference in Edmonton, Alberta, which was also a joint conference with the American Society for Limnology and Oceanography. But my talk is about this iconic wetland animal, the beaver, which has been a thread winding through my entire career. My book, Beavers, Boreal Ecosystem Engineers, was published by Springer in 2017 and summarizes much of my research. I'm going to tell you about how I became interested in beavers, some of what I learned about them, how that interest influenced my career choices, and how I came to write this book. I'm also going to offer you some pearls of wisdom based on what I've learned throughout my career as I studied the beaver. I became interested in ecology at a young age and enrolled as an undergrad in the Department of Natural Resources at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. During my senior year at Cornell, I began working for the Resource Information Laboratory, which prepared maps of land use and natural resources in New York State. I was making a whopping $3 an hour. But when I graduated, they offered me a full-time job for $4.26 an hour. My job duties expanded to air photo interpreter, using a pocket stereoscope to view pairs of aerial photos simultaneously. I used photographic and topographic clues to draw lines around the wetlands I saw, creating maps for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. So my first pearl of wisdom is, take that underpaid undergraduate job because it may lead to bigger and better things. This is where the beavers come in. The New York State Department of Environmental Conservation wanted to know if beaver-created wetlands could be identified by air photo interpretation. The DEC wanted information about the location and type of beaver activity for several reasons listed here. We consulted with DEC wildlife biologist Gary Parsons, who took us on a 50-mile trek into the Moose River Plain Wild Forest in the Adirondack Mountains during March of 1974 to show us beaver ponds. It was my first time on a snowmobile, and I can't say that it made me a snowmobiling fan, but that was the only way to get to the many beaver-created wetlands that we needed to field check. So my second piece of advice is, don't be afraid to learn how to operate strange machines. We learned in the field that beaver dams and lodges could be evidence of beaver activity, and that most dams could be seen on aerial photos. We wrote up our observations at the conclusion of the field trip and developed a standard operating procedure for identifying beaver activity. Our subcontract with the DEC ended in mid-1975, and one of the last things I did as part of my job was to write the technical report for our work. I was recently amazed to discover that this technical report is listed on Google Books. So my third pearl of wisdom is, publish your findings. I never would have thought that this document that I wrote in 1975 would still be available 45 years later. I would add a caveat to that advice: publish your findings in a place that will stand the test of time, such as SWS Journal of Wetlands. My publications have been cited more than 13,000 times, so I know that my work has had impact. In 1975, I moved to Wisconsin to enter graduate school, where I did my master's thesis on considerations for wetland inventories in Wisconsin. This work caught the attention of the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, a state agency charged with wetland conservation. I was hired in 1978 to develop and direct the Wisconsin Wetlands Inventory based on my thesis and my prior experience with the New York State Wetlands Inventory. Beaver evidence was again noted as a special modifier in the coding of wetlands that we mapped in Wisconsin. Now, during the time I directed the Wisconsin Wetlands Inventory, I was also a doctoral student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I received my doctorate in 1982. However, it didn't earn me any job advancement or pay increase from the Wisconsin DNR. So I moved to Minnesota in 1985 when I got a postdoctoral position at the Natural Resources Research Institute of the University of Minnesota, Duluth. We were studying the ecological effects of beaver ponds under a project funded by the National Science Foundation, and I was hired because of my expertise in mapping beaver ponds on aerial photos, starting with my earliest job 11 years before. We showed that as the beaver population of Voyageurs National Park recovered from overtrapping and expanded into new habitats, they flooded 13% of the landscape, creating a mosaic of ponds and wetlands in areas that had previously been continuous forest. It was fun and interesting work. Which leads to my fourth piece of advice. Sometimes you have to move to advance your career. While working at the Natural Resources Research Institute, I got a lot of practice at grant writing, and I became rather successful at it. I received 7 NSF grants, of which 4 were related to my beaver research. Later in my career, I was invited by NSF to be the visiting program director for the Ecosystem Studies program in 2000 through 2002, where I was able to fund other scientists' wetland research. My fourth pearl of wisdom is learn how to write grant proposals. This ability will help you regardless of your type of employment. Networking with other scientists helped improve my own research. One of my collaborators in 1993 was Tatiana Belyeva, a visiting hydrologist from the Russian Academy of Sciences. Tatiana and I collaborated on research applying a hydrologic model to beaver impounded watershed in northern Minnesota. Tatiana stayed in the US and got a grant from the International Research Exchanges Board, which is a nonprofit organization that specializes in global education and development. And that allowed Tatiana and me to visit Russia to collaborate with Russian beaver scientists and observe the works of the Eurasian beaver, castor fiber. At the time, most ecosystem scientists I was working with were men. Here is a photo of the participants in a 1988 workshop that I attended. Note that I am the only female among the 19 people in the picture. This leads to my sixth piece of advice: network with colleagues. The contacts and friendships that I've made while attending meetings or serving on review panels have been invaluable in my career. I was still seeking career advancement and wanted to work with students. In 2003, I applied for and got a position as a professor at South Dakota State University. An advantage of being a professor is the ability to influence future generations of wetland scientists. One of the people I worked with was Marla Stripe-Face Collins, a Lakota woman from Sinta Gleska University, a South Dakota tribal college. Marla asked me to be her mentor under the Ecological Society of America's SEEDS program, helping with their project on the Standing Rock Reservation. Marla showed that beaver dams in Oak Creek retained pools of water in the stream bed, providing a water source to livestock and wildlife during periods when the unimpounded stream bed dried up completely. Marla is now Tribal Relations Specialist for the U.S. Forest Service in Rolla, Missouri. So my final piece of advice is be a mentor and get a mentor. With that, I'd like to thank my mentor, Joy Zedler, who you will be hearing from later on in this webinar. Joy has been my colleague, co-author, and mentor since we first met in 1991. In 2014, I was fortunate to receive an Opus Award from the National Science Foundation. The aim of this prestigious award is to allow investigators to revisit and synthesize a body of their prior research in a way that will enable new understanding. My Opus Award paid my summer salary so that I could write my beaver book. OPUS recipients are required to attend a principal investigators meeting that is held every 2 years, and this is the one I attended in 2015. Note that once again, I am the only female in the room. Has nothing changed? Fortunately, women have long been influential in wetland science and management and have been leaders in our Society of Wetland Scientists, and I'm proud to be one of them. So if we take the pearls of wisdom and string them into a necklace, the bottom line is follow your passion. Find work that interests you and it will last throughout your career. That's all I have to say, and now I turn it over to Line Rochefort at Laval University in Quebec.
Thank you, Carol. Okay, so here it is that I will really thank you for the invitation to this webinar, where my contribution in career has been rebuilding peatland after resource extraction, and I will a little bit discuss how I got there and talk a little bit about the future in research where I'd like to go. Myself, who I am, so I'm a French Canadian. I come from like the most French part of North America, really raised in the boreal forest zone. That's the end of where you can do agriculture here. After that, there's no road to access all the northern part of Quebec. When I was young, I was right away by grade 6 attracted to natural science. And I had friends that were boys, and they could go to natural science camps where it was only for boys only. There was no way that girls could go to this science camp in that time. So that really a little bit saddened me at that time. But I kept to go out with them and learn from what they learn in the camps. And one of my feeling is that to be able in general to read soil, decode the landscape, understand ecosystem, it's important a bit that we invest to learn, you know, the biodiversity of one group of organism or skills like in geology or the likes, you know, like describing soils or something like that. Myself, my skill has been bryophyte ecology and know some of the bryophytes of northern disturbed ecosystem. But last year, I also published a book on how to identify the sphagnum species of Eastern North America. And that learning a skill to know well some plants, in this case, the wetland plants, then I could move on to work at the ecosystem level. And in terms of introduction and presentation, then my main scientific achievement, I could say, was learning to manipulate the tiny mosses with big machines, you know, like for large-scale restoration of peatlands. And then here, as Carol just been talking about all the beaver were ecosystem engineer, then in our boreal forest, you know, the sphagnum peat moss is also the main ecosystem engineer for helping the building of peatlands, the boreal peatlands or the muskegs. So this is a little bit what I succeeded. This is a picture I took early on in my career in 1992, actually. So you see a peat extraction sites. These peat fields here are like 500 meter long. And then you see here the tractor extracting the peat. And my first question was, how can we go from there back to peatlands that will look like this? You know, this is our northern muskeg looking. And then this is something that in career then I succeeded to do, is like learning to manipulate the tiny mosses. Here you see at one of our research stations, so that was left unrestored 28 years ago, how it looks like, and then 6 years later, how it can look like. So far, now as of 2020, we have 125 plus sites that have been restored across Canada that are, you know, usually bigger than 5 hectares. So, and this is really going on, and I'm really pleased to see this change from the industry, very interested into doing the restoration. But how did I get there? I'd say my first challenge for me, I show you how I was really from the north, very French area. When I was young, I always stayed there. We never traveled. My parents never traveled. We had a cottage by a lake, and that's where I spent my summer. So when I decided, okay, I want to go in biology, so I had to go to Quebec City. I tell you, after my first week in the big city, I just wanted to go home. Like, for me, it was too big. I was lost. And then my mother said, oh, well, you should stay there another week. You know, like we did all the trouble of finding an apartment, stay one more week. And then, you know, you have the all the parties that start the initiation and all that, and you get involved into group. And then I hang on finally to stay and do my degree in Quebec City. Also, I find that through your career, it's important to choose different summer jobs, you know, like, because it really helps to define what you like and what you don't like. So again, showing here where I'm from, the Quebec, but then I started to work in the north. So all this purple here color is where is the tundra, and that's really where I took a liking to lichens and mosses. So summer jobs are, you know, important, I think, in your development of your career. Also, for sure, for me, it's always a good thing to learn a second language. Then maybe you say, oh, okay, yes, it's easy because you know, everybody speaks English and you have to learn English, but still you have to do it. Myself, I decided as an undergrad, my last year, to to apply for a scholarship to go on an exchange program at Humboldt State University, which is in Northern California. And I must say, it didn't take long that as soon as I arrived there, I realized that, oh my God, a great part of the United States actually speaks Spanish. So I started to take Spanish lesson as well. So I think learning languages really helps you to, you know, go and get to understand some of the other culture, and the networking is great with other researchers as well. Another thing that I learned from Humboldt State University, I learned a lot of skills, like, you know, we were close to the redwood forest, go there to learn the fungi. I took fungi classes, my lichens, that's where I learned it. It's smaller, you're close. So for me, at least for sure, at the undergrad level, I really do not believe in small versus large or famous university for training. I know this is right now a big debate in North America, and also parents are trying to find a lot of money to put their kids into big university. But I think, you know, you can find your way through small and not so expensive university for training. One thing that I thought was important throughout your career is believe in your idea as a graduate student. You're the best know your field because you read every day about it, and sometimes more than your mentor. Here, this is a picture of myself during my master thesis, where I was looking at the impact of acid rain in peatlands, and mostly looking at what happens not to the overall ecosystem, but just on the mosses, mostly on the hummocks mosses, and also in fans, so in richer type of peatlands. And also looking at the gradient of what happened to the mosses, the one from the top of the hummock and the one in the depressions. And when I presented my research project, it was really unnerving because I did my research at the experimental lake area in Northern Ontario. And then the director of the research station was Dr. Dave Chandler, who had received a Stockholm Water Prize in '91, which is, you know, the equivalent of a Nobel Prize, but in environment, for all his research that he did into the eutrophication of lake and the acidification of freshwater lake. And then I didn't know then, but, you know, he's a limnologist. For him, he thought that, you know, I was losing my time. I was going to lose my time to do that. Said, you will find nothing. Everything will get buffer. But yes, if you think of a lake, that acid rain gets into a lake. If the lake is rich, everything gets buffer. But in the wetlands or in the peatlands, you know, first you have the mosses on the top, and they first receive that rain. So I'm just saying I kept my idea, I did it, and right on, you know, as a master's student, I could publish in ecology, and really that helped me for the start of my career. So yes, it's not so easy, but go ahead, believe in your idea if you think they are a sound idea. Here, this is another example. When I started here as a tenure track position at Laval University, I did a project from Johnson & Johnson from 1991 to 1998. How can we grow sphagnum biomass? They wanted sphagnum biomass to produce sanitary napkin. So in 1991 was the start of my academic career. When we started, we were two co-researchers. So I had my graduate mentor that was in Western Canada and myself. And we started by cultivating the sphagnum, you know, in these petri dishes or in these vials, and we thought we could grow it as we do for brewing beer. And then for me, it took 1 or 2 years, and I said, no, I could not see the large-scale future of it, of doing it and cultivating that way. Too much fungi, too much problem. And I think we have to move outside. We have to move, you know, in the field and use the sun and use the land outside. So I decided to abandon it anyway. But it was not an easy decision, because it's what you had to do is to try to grow sphagnum, as you see here, into this type of dry environment. This was the land that Johnson & Johnson was leasing then. And my first experiments, this is me in yellow here on the left, nothing grew. Everything I tried, like, oh, this like 27 replicates, and my two first graduate students, actually after a year, they just quit. This is, oh, she's a loser. We're not going to get anywhere to do graduate studies with them. And again, you can talk to my father. I thought of quitting university as well. So I can tell you I did not sleep well neither before reporting to Johnson & Johnson. But what was great is that in Johnson & Johnson, they do a lot of R&D. They know we can make mistakes, and they still went on, believe in me, and we continue the program. And after several years of failure and successes, now we are planning, you know, a commercial scale-up of producing sphagnum biomass. If you think you have the right idea, go ahead and follow them. And again, keeping with working with my own idea against some of the main current of thinking, then now I'm being asked often to do I'm doing a lot of technological transfer at the international level, such as here in South Korea, where they're trying to grow the sphagnum on the roofs of Seoul city as, you know, carbon sequestration mitigation to climate change. Now, on another topic, since I did this work with Johnson & Johnson, I've been asked by several industry to start to do projects and think about how they could go about to restore peatlands where they used to be peatlands, and now they've been doing either mining for gold, or here this is petrol extraction and all that. And I'd say that each time I'm starting with a new corporate industry in R&D, I always say, as a young person or start with a small project to develop a relationship of trust. And I always find it's easier than to jump in a big project right away and then being really unsure and not confident about it. And as an example, in 2018, the cranberry producer of the province of Quebec, they wanted me right away to start a R&D project, but to restore peatland. Say, oh, we would like to have a demonstration, and could you just do that? And I kind of back up and I said, well, I would prefer that first to look at what's done, what is done elsewhere, because I knew I had helped some of the planning for restoring peatland post-cranberry production in Massachusetts, and then just go with a report. And so we started with something smaller, like, you know, around $7,000, and now we just building up from this, and we have applied for a bigger grant. Career and family now. You know, I think as women, we really have to project ourselves in the future with or without kids. And we should not passively let time pass by, and because as it is less of an issue for men, we have the biological clock. And myself, I have 2 boys, and I can tell you, once I had kids, I never worked the weekends. Always been with them. I finish Friday 4:30 in the afternoon and start 8:30 Monday morning. I'm really though concentrated during my week, but I don't work the weekends. And my 2 boys, they were mogul skier. They did racing up to the national level, and now they are in their 20s, both studying at the university, but it's irrelevant. I mean, actually, one is not studying at the university anymore, but is working for Ducks Unlimited, and they're both still coaching. And it's really fun as a family because we have something in common in winters where we all go back to the ski hills, and they are coaching for the freestyle skiing. So where do I see the future now in research in wetlands myself? It's really now coming back to my research theme of the 90s, which is the cultivation of biomass on wet and degraded, rewetted peatlands. As the palidiculture, there's really a push that we believe is the palidi future, of for several of the wetland lands that we have. So in how, just coming back, this is my last slide. I'd say know some biodiversity, be a naturalist with one group of living organism or skills in soil characterization or the like. Richness there's a lot of richness in learning languages. It opens doors. I did several work in South America, but for me, speaking Spanish, French, and English, all the Americas, I can work out there. Do not take the idea of senior scientists for granted. Do question established ideas, persevere in what you are convinced, if it is a sound avenue of research. When starting a new R&D collaboration, start with small project to build trust. And then maybe you are very passionate wetland scientist, but still think of the future with or without kids carefully. So persevere. I thank you very much. And just before finishing, if you want to hear more about ecological restoration, reclamation, wetland management, then you are very welcome to the next meeting that we have jointly for the first time with the Society of Ecological Restoration and a CLRE. And the SWS, Society of Wetland Scientists, were in Quebec City in 2000. We had a wonderful really conference, and we hope to have a very nice time there for sharing idea. With this, I will hand it to the last speaker, Joy Zedler from University of Wisconsin. Thank you.
Hello from Wisconsin, where my career transitioned from wastelands to wetlands to wonderlands. 50 years ago, I was a UW-Madison graduate student. Sandhill cranes were threatened with extinction due to overhunting, and wetland was not yet a word. Wet places were considered Hello from Wisconsin, where my career transitioned from wastelands to wetlands to wonderlands. 50 years ago, I was a UW-Madison graduate student. Sandhill cranes were threatened with extinction due to overhunting, and wetland was not yet a word. Wet places were considered wastelands, places to dump trash. Later, 2 of my students, both women, helped me track the use of the word wetland, which became common in newspapers after 1980. Back in the 1960s, Buena Vista Marsh was a wasteland in central Wisconsin. I used surveyors' records to reconstruct the 1860s vegetation. It had been a marsh and a swamp a century earlier, but after being drained, wildfires burned off the peat and large areas were cultivated for bluegrass seed. Later, many fields were abandoned. I called myself an old field ecologist, working on weeds in relation to microtopography. Today, I'd be called a wetland ecologist, studying a novel ecosystem and its stressors and drivers. But regardless of terms, the site was a prairie chicken wonderland, thanks to former students of Aldo Leopold. Fran Hammerstrom hosted me while I did my fieldwork, so long as I didn't complain about her 2 pet owls flying around inside the house. Fran was a unique role model. She absolutely delighted in challenging the roles that women were supposed to fill, as touted in her autobiography. One day, for example, she asked me to help her butcher a roadkill deer on her kitchen floor. She had to feed 2 hungry beaks. After a year at the University of Missouri, where I taught myself about algae, Paul and I moved to San Diego State. I was intrigued by tidal marsh vegetation because it varied with microtopography. The most extensive salt marsh was next to Mexico, where raw sewage flowed downstream from the city of Tijuana. Politicians called it a swill pit. I called it Tijuana Estuary. A doctoral student measured vascular plant productivity while I measured that of algal mats, which were just as productive. This was news, as elsewhere marsh grasses outproduced soil algae. That made sense where soil salinities were lower, in other words, everywhere else. Few had heard of Pacific coastal wetlands. But in 1978, Evelyn Schur invited me to a conference with salt marsh ecologists from the East and Gulf coasts. At that time, Tijuana Estuary joined the realm of salt marsh science. Continued research at the site transformed the swill pit into a National Estuarine Research Reserve. Such sites were supposed to be pristine ecosystems. Not this one, it was instead a research wonderland. Coastal developers were eager to make millions by filling salt marshes to build hotels. Some filled first and were forced to mitigate damages later. The demand for trained practitioners prompted me to build the Pacific Estuarine Research Lab. In the 1990s, we promoted the adaptive restoration of salt marshes as large field experiments, and plans for Tijuana Estuary grew to include our 20-acre comparison of intertidal areas with and without tidal creek networks. Again, microtopography was an important driver of biodiversity support. Here and then I have some pink labels that list authors of publications and the ratio of females to males. Part of the inspiration for restoration came from the near pristine San Quintin Bay in Baja California, where an annual plant, salt marsh birdsbeak, was abundant, in contrast to its endangered status in California. Dr. Celia Ibarra welcomed our work in Mexico and risked her government job by opposing coastal development. In San Diego, another brave woman, Joan Jackson, sued the Highway Department for not mitigating impacts of freeway widening. And when she won, my lab was asked to figure out how to restore habitat for the endangered birdsbeak along San Diego Bay. We began seeding in 1990, where we thought the 3 biotic requirements would be met, namely, in the upper left, its seeds need low soil salinity to germinate, its seedlings need a perennial host plant, and its flowers need bees to pollinate, and those bees burrow and nest in uplands. Still, our population crashed in 2014 when we counted only 62 plants. It recovered by 2016 from the seed bank, but it was time to analyze our count data, which spanned 26 years. Greg Noy and Megan Fellows figured out that a little-known tidal oscillation, the 18.6-year cycle of super high tides, explained much of the variability in our population counts. Long-term data made that discovery possible, and dedicated women made the long-term data possible. You can read the rest of the story in Restoration Ecology. In 1998, I returned to the UW-Madison as the first Alda Leopold Chair. My Arboretum office was on the spot where Paul and I had lived as caretakers 30 years earlier. My dream job called for place-based research in restoration ecology, so my students worked on wetland weeds and why they degrade wetlands, and then they explored native species to use in restoring sedge meadows. Here you see that 3 women learned that tussock sedge was easy to propagate, plus it grew tussocks that supported biodiversity and it stored carbon. Elsewhere, others touted their high rates of denitrification and methane oxidization. This is a restoration wonder plant. I pursued the role of microtopography in restoring wet meadows, and Jim Doherty tested 3 mound heights to jumpstart ecosystem services. But during the field tests, Mother Nature, a woman, intervened with an unusually wet year, followed by an unusually dry year. Most of the transplants died, so we capitalized on the extremes. Tussock sedge established best on high mounds in the wet conditions and on low mounds in dry conditions. In short, bumpy topography hedged bets against the kinds of events we can expect with climate change. Hooray for microtopography. In 2004, Paul and I moved next to Wabisa Wetlands, just outside Madison, where clear, cold springs flow year-round. The unique artesian waters and diverse biota led me to nominate it for Ramsar status. That was so much work filling out forms that the information morphed into an e-book. And last year, SWS honored Wabisa Wetlands with national recognition as a wetland of distinction. It's truly a wonderland. But it's not enough to describe wetland wonderlands. We need to help sustain them. And that means plugging leaks from ag fields and urban hardscapes, both of which discharge nutrients downstream. That began a series of studies on water quality improvement functions of wetlands. At the Madison Arboretum, I hijacked a stormwater treatment facility by convincing engineers to design parallel swales for interdisciplinary research. Again, Mother Nature intervened by providing subsoils with different infiltration rates in the upper right, which allowed us to compare hydroperiods. We learned that very small differences in hydroperiods led to large differences in ecosystem services. Wetlands also divide the dogma of upland ecology that diversity increases plant productivity. Instead, the high productivity of cattails in the impounding swale actually reduced diversity. In Wisconsin, the worst wetland weed is reed canary grass. And in the Wabisa wetlands, which are shown here in green, this weed is lapping at the edges of our diverse sedge meadows. I've been urging the county to use watershed approaches by working upstream to replace hardscapes with permeable surfaces, plus installing rain gardens, rain barrels, and green roofs, and especially restoring wetlands and sites that will trap runoff. Toward that goal, I encourage the Nature Conservancy and DNR to expand their Wetlands by Design program, and is now online for all Wisconsin watersheds, each one for up to 9 ecosystem services. Here's a sample map for flood abatement upstream from Wabisa wetlands. The red sites are potentially restorable wetlands, the green ones are existing wetlands, and the darkest colors indicate the highest levels of, in this map, flood reduction. I also encouraged my colleague Anita Thompson to have her water resources management students, 5 of whom were women, develop watershed strategies while earning their master's degrees. Now I'm helping our local land trust prioritize land acquisition and easements. It takes many steps to sustain wetlands, and women often take the lead. Well, how does all this stuff fit together? I tried to draw a nice, neat diagram to characterize my career, but the outcome was a collage like this scraggly oak. I studied wastelands in Wisconsin. My foray into phycology in Missouri was a turning point toward aquatic ecosystems, so I was able to teach aquatic ecology at San Diego State and to focus student and postdoc work on coastal wetlands by this time. Back at UW, I taught adaptive restoration and worked with students and postdocs to restore wetlands to wonderlands. Along the way, I argued that scientists whose research is publicly funded should write down more of their knowledge for broad audiences, and Sheila David gave me opportunities to do so at a national scale. It was her idea to have the National Research Council review restoration of aquatic ecosystems, and then to address wetland boundaries, and then compensatory mitigation. It was an honor to chair that third panel, plus I got to know Carol Johnston, who in 2005 led our collaboration of 5 women to develop Great Lakes wetland indicators. Over the decades, I wrote restoration guidebooks for various users, and when the internet arrived, I posted 40 fact-filled leaflets on the Arboretum website. I compiled a free ebook about saltmarsh secrets posted on the Tijuana Estuary website. That was followed by the Wabiza Wetlands ebook on the Town of Dunn website. This year I produced a kids book on sandhill cranes. I think of it as the, quote, research segregation concept for 5-year-olds, unquote. You might have to read it to believe it. I donate those books to nature organizations to disseminate to families. I can't say that much of my career was planned, but I had some key women enablers. Without my high school English teacher, I would never have gone to college. I also have to credit my husband Paul for continually supporting my career, along with our twin daughters, even though they didn't have much choice. Not surprisingly, they both work on water. The largest group on this career tree represents my 75 graduates. Only 10 were doctoral students, of which 6 were women. Most of my students wanted master's degrees to apply their research in ecological restoration. I've been told that I accomplished a lot with master's students because so many published their work. But it was the master's students who accomplished a lot, given opportunity, encouragement, and advice. 50 years ago, there was very little career advice for women, but here are a few things I learned along the way. I suggest thinking like a weed. Find opportunities and exploit the parts of the professional microtopography that best suits you. Capitalize on what you like doing well. Capitalize on Mother Nature's interventions. Be adaptive. Let some ideas germinate right away. Draw on reserves for new growth. Expect dead ends. Grow where you can. In general, multitask. Disperse your propagules widely. By that I mean new information, whether it's science, wetland management, or a kid's book, so future generations can grow up with positive feelings about wetlands. May you all invade wetland science and overcome any and all barriers that you encounter. Thank you for your attention. Be happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much to our presenters for sharing their stories. You know, we all hope to make a difference with our work in wetland science and management, and clearly these speakers show us how it's done. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your insights. And now we can open it up to questions for these speakers. If you, just a reminder, you can use the questions panel in the lower right-hand corner of your GoToMeeting panel to ask questions, and I can share them with our speakers. And I'd like to kick off the question session with a question or a comment from Ashley Giles. Ashley, thank you for using the question panel. And she said, this isn't necessarily a question. She says, I am just so blown away by this panel. I have studied all of you. It's such a treat to see you all live. I have struggled to find supportive female mentors in my practitioner career path. Perhaps this is competition for limited resources, but I loved Dr. Johnston's shout out to her mentor, Dr. Zedler. Seeing that inspires me. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all you do. So I'd like to, any response to Ashley's question?
I was just going to say it's a treat for me.
Let's wait just a minute. It looks like Joy's connection is a little shaky. Okay, I think we've got you back, Joy.
Okay, I was just saying to be alive still. It's a very long career.
Thank you for being live, Joy. It's nice to see everybody and see all their faces together for sure.
One piece of advice I might give is be a mentor for yourself. I think we are kind of socialized as women to be modest about our accomplishments, and we really need to say, I did this, this is good, and you should appreciate it in so many words.
I appreciate your mentorship. I thought you had it backwards on your slide. You said I was your mentor, but you taught me so much, Carol. So appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sorry, did I interrupt you, Lynn?
Nope.
Okay. Another question here from Kim Ponzio. And this is a question for all of you, so just let me know if you have a response to this question. I'd like to ask all the women leaders about female versus male wetland scientists and practitioners beyond ratios, because now that ratios are becoming more equal, the men seem to still hold higher positions and are paid more. Would anyone like to respond to that comment?
I can respond. I certainly followed my husband to California, and then the tables turned, and he followed me back to Wisconsin. So that was 30 years later, but we are pretty good co-equal partners.
As I learned from another group, you know, I think this is raising a very good point. In your career, choosing the partner with whom you will, you know, to achieve all your career goal. And likewise myself with my husband, you know, I choose where I wanted to train for the master thesis, but then I follow him, you know, for the PhD, and then he came back to me when I got the tenure track position, and we help each other. So and then in raising kids, there was absolutely no question. When we decided about it, he really told me, okay, if we go with having kids, it's going to be 50-50. Don't worry, it will not be 60-40 or something like that. So it is important. This is a choice in career that is important to make sure you talk about it and you find a partner that will be supportive for maybe the development of a double career, or sometimes not, you know. But I have a colleague here. She said, "Oh, I'm with this guy in social science, so happy we're having kids and stay at home." And for her, you know, he said, he just told her, take the whole front. You like it, you love it, I will support you. So you just have to talk about it. There's different models, but definitely something to talk with the partner we want to engage, I think, in life.
With regard to Kim's point on salary, one of the reasons why I changed jobs is to get a higher salary. I found it difficult to get a higher salary within an organization, but often I was more attractive to other organizations and could command, you know, a higher salary because of that. So that's something to consider if it's possible for you to move. I know not everyone can because of you know, commitments to a certain area, maybe family living there, but you know, that is one way to decrease the income disparity, I think, between men and women.
Yeah, hold on, Kathy. Let me see if I can unmute you from here. Kathy, can we hear you now?
Yeah, I think I can hear you. That sounds fine. I've got a couple of observations to Kim's query. I spent the last few years of my career at the Forest Service, and I found that they were very, very receptive and encouraging to female employees coming up. And looking back at the Institute of Pacific Islands Forestry, where both my husband and I worked, the leader of that group now is a woman who came in as an entry-level scientist. And so I'm encouraged certainly by federal government hires. And at the University of Florida, I've seen, I think I've seen a lot more women coming through than had been when I was younger. So I'm encouraged, at least for academic and government scientists. I'd like to make one comment about mentors. I think I learned as much from social science collaborators, women outside the discipline. Roz Naylor worked with us for several years, helping me to see Koshraians as a community of people and not a wetland island. So I would say to look closely for people outside your own discipline as well as within.
Okay, great. Thank you for your insights on that. We've got another question here from Emily Ott. Thanks for your question, Emily. She says, thank you. I enjoyed everyone's presentation. And I'd like to ask a question. Do any of you have any advice or anecdotes about field work when you are the only woman on field work trips?
Anecdotes. Yeah, the only thing I can see, it's not an anecdote, but that I did not receive well. When I started my career and I got like this first grant with Johnston & Johnson, then there's a colleague that came to a little bit like, you know, do some thinking with me in the field and all that. And he said, oh, if you're going to embark on this project, because this is all male that are operating the machines and the tractor and all that, this is a very male, you will have to find a male research professional to assist you. We specifically said, this is a male work and you should find a male. But that was, like I said, at the beginning of the 1990s. I'm not sure you would say that yet. But anyhow, I'd say that most of my, right now I have 4 research professionals, like research assistant around me, and they are all women. And in general, all my graduate students has no problem to deal with petrol industry or mining industry as women, you know, outside in the field.
We had some problems when I started working on Koshrai. There was an issue of whether women should be working by themselves, and of course our response to that was that nobody should ever be working by themselves in the field. That there should always be at least 2 people. And we found that in a culture where people may not be accustomed to seeing 2 or 3 women working in a professional capacity and in field work, that as long as there were more than one of them, that seemed to make it all right, and they encountered very little difficulty.
I think that some of the difficulty can come sometime. It can be cultural. I think in general, my feeling is that we are lucky enough in North America and Central Europe. But some of my colleagues, not colleagues, but people that I know in wetland science, They told me working in Indonesia as a female was not easy because it's dominated, you know, it's a Muslim world, and with the religion and the relation to women, and have a woman to lead a team of research is really not easy. That was what somebody told me experience in Indonesia. And I talked with other women from China. I've been in China, and they told me for them, right now, there's a dichotomy in the sense that women do not go in the field. It's all the guys that go and do the collection of field data, working in peatland ecology and all that, and the women are expected to do the data crunching and work the data in the laboratory, but they are not expected to go in the field. So I think there's a little bit sometimes of dichotomy depending on the culture.
Got another question for all of our panelists coming from Jenny Sandifer. Jenny is wondering, what would you recommend to someone who is starting out after undergrad as a consultant doing delineation and permitting, who seeks to conduct research and advance their career in wetland science, but is unsure where to start?
I always tell students to volunteer. You can volunteer for any number of environmental organizations and try short periods, short stints with different groups and find out what kind of field work you like or what kind of organization you like. And you've invested some time, but it might be the most important time in your career. Pick the right match.
Yeah, and I would add to this is very, I do the same thing. All my students, I want them to get involved in some sort of conservation little group around the city first and all that. And sometimes to look into, while you are working, into continuing education. You know, so let's say you're doing on delineation and all that, you've been trained as a wetland scientist, maybe you want to look more into geomatics, you know, and find more about ArcGIS or something. So there could be some courses that are, you know, at the university or elsewhere that can be followed. So that's that. And the number 3, I'd say, look for maybe some local societies. There's a lot of societies, like here within Quebec, I encourage a lot my students to be member of the Biological Society, because they organize a lot of outings and training in the field. So that can be some avenue.
I would add to taking a job that you might think is not an end level job, but it's just entry level, just to build up those networks. And then once you have networks and people become aware of your capabilities, then it's easier to move on to something more advanced.
Do we have any more questions from our audience? One more question. This comes from Rachel Schultz. Rachel, who is also on the symposium board for the Women in Wetland section. Hi, Rachel. She is asking our panelists, how important has your involvement with the Society of Wetland Scientists been for your career? What advice about involvement with this society and other organizations would you have?
Mm-hmm. Well, I have some advice. I didn't follow it myself, but I think it's important to pick a society and try to give more of your time to that one society. I was juggling about 4 most of my career. I couldn't go to all of the meetings. I couldn't get to know all of the people. But you can, you'll be surprised to figure out how welcome your interest and offers to help will be. And you can develop important networks by starting as a volunteer to help at a conference and then move on to volunteer to run for office. And someday you'll be on the next Carol Johnston as president of the society.
I found my involvement with SWS to be a real eye-opener because of course, I was an academician at the time, and it really wasn't until I became president, which was, I guess, 2004, that I got to know a lot of the people who are consultants. I mean, the mix of wetland ecologists is really, I think, one of its main strengths, and it's not just a matter of going to people's papers and seeing what they're presenting, but working with them on the board of directors and so forth, and seeing what their perspectives are. It really opens your eyes, and it brings you connections too to these people to serve as reviewers or field sites to visit and so forth. And connected with that is to take full advantage of the international wetland meetings. They may not be always sponsored by SWS, but SWS is usually very, very well involved in them, and it's just a wonderful way to make connections around the world.
Of course, I was the first woman president back in 1992, and at that time, SWS was going through a lot of turmoil because there were a lot of growing pains. I feel like I learned a lot from other board members who were working for other employment sectors, working for the government, working for consulting, and also learning more just about how to manage an organization and the tremendous amount of work that it takes to have a professional organization. Now we have a group that helps manage the conference conference setup and membership and all that. But when I was president, our executive secretary was just operating out of his garage. So things have progressed, and I've learned a lot as president.
I can say myself on my side, I haven't hold any position within SWS. I'm a lifetime member from a long time, but I've been on the scientific board, if you want, of another society called International Peatland Society. And that society is more of an industrial regroupment at the beginning. Now they're changing, to be more academic and industry, but at first it was really industrial, representing all the peat industry in the world. And when they asked me to take the position of at the scientific board and to manage all the scientific side, I was the first woman ever to be on the board after 40 years of the existence of the society. And I just must say it was something, because it was not a North American, I was there with Russian that had the translator, with people from Poland, from northern Finland, the Baltic country. And at first, you're not really big in your shoes, I must say. You listen. I think you have to be humble. You listen, learn the society, how it works. But then after a while, you have, again, to promote your ideas and what you believe. And I tell you, it was a different world. And the first thing that I worked on was transparency. A lot of things were not transparent. So I didn't work so much with working with there's a microphone making noise. Can we mute the other maybe? Okay. Yeah, so I'm just saying, again, first development of where you want, have your goal, get involved in society. And even though I was within industry, I feel there's been a lot of changes. It's been improved, and they are thinking more about their action and their impact on the environment.
Well, sorry. Did I cut somebody off?
I have a question myself. Did I read the sidebar correctly that there are over 500 people that registered for this webinar?
It's actually, that's
If
our
so, I'm
maximum,
really thrilled
but
to
we
have
have,
that kind of
we have,
interest, and it's certainly clear that the future needs people involved in wetland protection, wetland research, wetland education, wetland restoration. So I hope we had a small bit of encouragement for you.
yeah, thanks, Joy. We had 50 participants, so we could handle 500, but we had 50, which is a really
50,
wonderful
okay.
turnout. Yeah, but I wanted to, we were wrapping up the end of our webinar time slot here, so I just wanted to read one more comment from Kim Ponzio, and she says, thanks to all the wonderful women leaders for your presentations, and to me for moderating a webinar. And everyone, this is the very first 4-person SWS webinar and the first webinar to use webcams to show speakers. So these women are continuing to deliver in very monumental ways. So thank you so much for your contributions. And personally, I would like to thank each of our speakers for their impact on myself and my career. Lynne, your field trip in 2000 into call was just so important for me. And Kathy, you took me to lunch during my first semester at University of Florida, which was so important to calming me down and getting me focused. And Joy, recently you're sharing your sandhill crane siblings book with me and my kids has just opened up a whole world of sandhill cranes for us. And Carol, I really have enjoyed watching your career be so multifaceted over the years, and it's inspired me to continue to look for ways to reinvent myself. So thank you so much for all of you for your impact on myself, and I know many other people's careers.
Thank you for the organization, that's for sure.
I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much, Carrie.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to show my screen to wrap up just a few items of business here for the webinar. Thanks again to our speakers for their presentations and answering our questions. If we have piqued your interest in the Women in Wetlands section of the Society of Wetland Scientists, we are really looking forward to the RE3 2020 conference in Quebec, where we have 3 opportunities for you to be involved. We've got a symposium that is going to be about smooth transitions in careers and how people have navigated major switches in their careers. We are going to be offering a luncheon to continue that discussion in small groups, which is going to be free. So don't miss that when you're registering for the conference. Please register and let us know you're coming, and we'll give you a free lunch. Also, we have our section meeting. You can get involved with the society as what we call a micro volunteer. It means that you are committing yourself to an extremely limited and defined amount of time just to support the section. And we're excited to hold some discussions during our section meeting on how we're going to make the most of our newly awarded section improvement grant. So we'd like to thank SWS for that, as well as this opportunity to expand on our symposium from last year. Lastly, I would like to thank our sponsors again. As a reminder, these are our sponsors: Water Resources, Hydrologic and Hydraulic Education, and the Whittington Group. And so that leaves just 2 more openings for sponsors. Please contact SWS staff to inquire about how you can promote your organization by sponsoring the webinar series. So thanks again to those 2 sponsors. And then lastly, next up, we have our mark your calendars for our next SWS webinar held on February 20th. Will be presented by special guests from the Society of Wetland Scientists Professional Certification Program, Matt Simpson and Robin Myers. And finally, Be sure to subscribe or follow Society of Wetland Scientists via these different social media channels. And we have a YouTube channel where all our webinars are posted 3 months after the original broadcast. If you're Spanish speaking, be certain to subscribe to the Latin American and Caribbean regions Facebook page at the link here. And lastly, thanks again to our presenters and for the Society for hosting this fantastic webinar series.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.